Okay, so this is going to be the presentation on the battles of the Texas Revolution. First we're going to start off with our TEKS. Our TEKS for today is 3C, which is explain the issues surrounding significant events of the Texas Revolution, including the Battle of Gonzales, the Siege of the Alamo, William B. Travis's letter to the people of Texas and all Americans of the world, which you will be analyzing in a group activity later. And then the heroism of the diverse defenders who gave their lives there, and the Constitution of Convention of 1836, and then the Battle of San Jacinto. So before we start, I think we should go back and review last time's lesson, give some context before we jump into today's lesson, and talk about what was going on in Mexico. So Mexico was in a rebellion. The Mexican states, led by the Yucatan state, the Zacatecas, the Coahuila, and Texas, were all upset because Santa Anna overthrew his own government. And he threw out the Constitution of 1824 too, which ended federalism and seized the dictatorial powers for himself. Santa Anna felt that federalism failed to bring stability to Mexico, and it would do better to have a dictatorship, and he gave himself that position. In Texas, in December of 1835, General Cosa and the Mexican army were defeated by the Texans at the siege of Bear. With the surrender of the Mexican army, they were released and they were made to return to Mexico and never return to Texas. And a lot of the people thought that the Mexican troops would remain out of the region, so they were not going to come back, at least for a couple of months. But from Santa Anna's perspective, Texas was in a state of rebellion, and his solution was very, very easy, was make an example out of the rebels. So that was what was happening in Mexico and Texas at the time. Now we're gonna jump into the players really fast. You can pull out your graphic organizer because I'm gonna be mentioning a lot of names as I work through the presentation, and that'll be a good resource to have if you forget them. But really fast, we're gonna go over them. Remember that Sam Houston, he thought that war was inevitable, and he was named the commander of the newly established Texas Army in November of 1835. Jim Bowie was a leader of the volunteer militia at the start of the Alamo siege. William B. Travis was the lieutenant colonel in the Texas Army under the leadership of Sam Houston. And then he later became the commander at the Alamo when Colonel Neal left the fort. Davy Crockett arrived at the Alamo with 12 volunteers. He was also the governor of Texas, if you remember that from your vocab when we were first going over it in the unit. Juan Seguin believed in federalism and he was loyal to Texas, and he recruited 37 Tejanos for the rebellion and fought Santa Anna in the Battle of Bear, and then fought him again at the Battle of San Jacinto. Juana Navarro Alsbury was married to Dr. Horace Alsbury, who was part of the siege of San Antonio de Bear, and she was an eyewitness to the fighting. You're going to analyze some of her stuff later in the lesson too. Susanna Wilkerson Dickinson was married to Almero Dickinson, sorry, and he was involved in the Battle of Gonzales, which was the first battle skirmish of the Texas Revolution. San Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, which is, I guess you could say, the star of this whole thing. He was a soldier and the president of Mexico, and he was originally, like I said, elected as a Federalist in 1833, before he threw that out the window and made himself a dictator. So we're going to start off with Santa Anna arriving in San Antonio. So in February 23rd of 1836, Santa Anna and his army arrived in San Antonio to lay siege to the Alamo. Everyone that was there kind of rushed to the Alamo to protect themselves, and they barricaded themselves inside. The Alamo defenders didn't want to die there. They firmly believed that they were not going to die there. They thought people were going to come and help them. And one of the first things William B. Travis did was send out couriers to request reinforcements. And he sent that to the Goliad, where James Fannin had a much larger contingent, and he sent it to Texas settlements. They really did think that help was coming. And then we're going to talk about the Constitutional Convention of March 2nd, 1836. So this was happening at the same time as everything was happening at the Alamo. So near the end of the siege of the Alamo, delegates from across Texas met on March 2nd, 1836 at Washington on the Brazos to form a new Texas government. But when news came of the situation in San Antonio, a lot of them wanted to ride out and go help. But Sam Houston told them that it was better to establish a government. And that new government elected David G. Burnett as the temporary president and Tejano delegate Lorenzo de Zavala as the temporary vice president. The delegates declared Texas independent from Mexico on that day, March 2nd, 1836, and named Sam Houston as the commander of the new Texas Army and wrote a constitution for Texas. So the siege of the Alamo. Strategically, if we're talking about strategy, it was a terrible idea. The complex, as you can see in this picture, was very, very big. The Mexican army, they kept constant cannonade, so they kept shooting cannons throughout the entire 13-day siege. And the defenders at the Alamo were really holding out. Like I keep saying, they really did think help was coming. They were hoping that Texans would unite for the cause and send reinforcements. On March 1st, 1836, a small group of 32 men did come to reinforce the Alamo, and in celebration of that, Travis fired off 2 cannons. 2 days later, though, another writer brought the news that Fannin and his men from Goliad were not coming. So it was only those 32 extra men that they got. But like I said, let's look at this graph of the Alamo really fast. Like I said, it's so big. Its perimeter was almost a quarter of a mile long. It had 12-foot high walls, which were 2 feet thick, and they had a water well within it, some cattle and some corn for food, things like that. They did have an advantage of having about 19 pieces of weapons modeled up on the walls, which were cannons, and most of them had actually come from when the Mexican army had retreated, and they took those. But they really needed so many more men to defend such a big complex. They only had about 180 to about 220 people ready to defend, and they needed maybe 3 or 4 times that much. So if Fannin and his men from Goliad had actually come and helped, they would have had a lot better chance than they did with only 180 to 220 men. So the Battle of the Alamo. So Santa Anna ordered to stop firing the cannons on March 5th, hoping it would kind of lower the defenses of the defenders of the Alamo. He really had a really big advantage. He had about 1,100 troops that were going to be attacking from 4 different points. And like I said, the defenders of the Alamo only had 180 compared to like 100,100 or 1,100. So sorry. That was a really big difference. So before dawn on March 6th, the battle of the Alamo started, and Santa Anna's army launched flares, and they began firing as they advanced from all 4 sides. So lancers encircled the Alamo to prevent anyone from escaping and from the Mexican soldiers from retreating. They moved into position about midnight. Like I said, it was before dawn. They really wanted to get a move on while the defenders of the Alamo were sleeping. And by 5 in the morning, everything was in place. And then half an hour later, Santa Anna ordered that attack. Everyone inside of the Alamo kind of was rushing to get into position. And the heaviest part of that first wave of fighting happened at the North Wall. So the Texans were, firing their muskets and their cannons, trying to push back the Mexican army. And after 2 failed attempts by the Mexican army, they eventually did make it onto through the North Wall during the 3rd wave. When they finally breached the Alamo, the Texans started retreating really quickly towards the chapel, and they tried to, spike the cannons again, but eventually the Mexicans got control of them, turned them, and then started firing at them. So some Texans tried to, run away and flee, but they were eventually, killed right on the spot. Historians are saying that uh, about 20 Texans tried to climb the walls and escape, but they too ended up dying there. And the bloodiest fighting, or really the most vicious of everything, really happened in the long barracks, which is where you'll hear if we, when we read these historical documents, is where everything really went down because of the hand-to-hand combat. So the last place to fall was the Alamo Chapel, where Davy Crockett and his 6 men were surrounded, and according to historians, they were also killed right on the spot. There were several survivors though, but they were all women and children, and one man though, and he was the slave of William B. Travis, who was spared. In total, 30 civilians survived, including Susanna Dickinson and her daughter, who were sent to Sam Houston to tell him about the events that happened at the Alamo.